Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ruth Wishart. It's my very great pleasure to be chairing this afternoon's event at the Edinburgh International Book Festival. And our guest this afternoon, as many of you will know, trained as and indeed worked as a medical doctor. But like so many of the Palestinian diaspora, much of her life has been devoted to the struggle to regain the homeland. Now, as recent and traumatic and tragic events have underlined, there's also the constant need to highlight the suffering and loss of those still living in Gaza and what remains of the West Bank. Her personal struggle as an author and as an academic commentator has been made more problematical, she says in the book, because when she's living and working in the UK, she seems not sufficiently Arab enough in the land of her forebears. Conversely, when she's working here, she's too Arab for the people with whom she's working. And I almost got that right, and I'll try it again some other day. It's been quite a long day. She remains undaunted, however, in her attempts to bring some form of mutual understanding to a part of the Middle East where mutual suspicion is more of a natural currency. Her personal contribution includes setting up the first British Palestinian charity some 4 decades ago. Her latest book, Return, is an admirably honest account of the prejudices and misconceptions underlying the seemingly intractable hostilities there. But it's also a window on the dispiriting landscape of those of her fellow Palestinians who survive but obviously cannot thrive in a ghetto without a means of escape or the autonomy to build a prosperous future. It's not statistics, ladies and gentlemen, which bring home the price of conflict and suffering, but the testimony of those individuals whose lives and hopes have been blighted by it. Return gives us that insight and sheds a powerful, if hardly optimistic, light on this benighted region. Please welcome Ghada Karmi.
Well, thank you, Ruth, for that introduction. And it's a great pleasure to see so many of you here. Now, I would like to think that that's because I'm wonderful, but I really do think to me, it's a testimony to the importance of Palestine.
I think, Ghada, if we may, before we get involved in the conversation, it would be useful for the audience for us to tease out the why of the return, the why of the title for you.
Yes, this book, as you see, is called Return, and you're probably too far away to see the picture on the cover, which shows you a key across an open palm. Now, this image, honestly, is iconic for the Palestinians. It's iconic because the key represents the keys to their homes before they were expelled in 1948. And a lot of people are hanging on to these keys as their proof, their talisman, of this terrible tragedy that happened to them. Now, the book is not, as you might think, about the return of the refugees or something like that. It's not. But it is a theme that runs throughout the book in one shape or form, one shape or another, precisely because if there is one issue in the world that every Palestinian knows about, responds to, feels passionately about, it's returning to the homeland. Wherever we are, wherever our circumstances, the one burning thought remains that we were expelled, we were dispossessed, and we must go home. One day we must go home. So this sentiment is so powerful that the book, as I hope you'll see, is really a meditation on return. And you can return in many different ways. You can return physically, you can return spiritually, you can return emotionally, you have a partial return, but the issue always is return. That is the one basic, fundamental theme, object, aim of all Palestinians.
I was very taken by a passage in the book when you were talking about when your family first came over to live in London after being dispossessed, and your mother was so convinced that this was a temporary arrangement that she refused to put up so much as a fresh sheet of wallpaper because she was going to go back any day now.
That's right. And that was, of course, very common for Palestinians because when they were expelled or had to flee for their lives, nobody for a moment thought that this was for good or for decades. Absolutely not. So people, in our case, my mother took one suitcase in which she packed our pajamas or something because we were coming back, she thought, in a couple of weeks. Of course, we didn't. And then we ended up in England, I suppose, as refugees. And my mother never abandoned this idea. So when, she resisted every kind of improvement in our house, which was humble enough already, and there was no sense. We said, well, we're cold, central heating was coming in, said, no, we're not staying. So what about a fridge? She'd say, no point doing that, we're not staying. As you say, it was a refrain the whole time. So we lived this kind of temporary, suspended state for as long as I can remember when I was growing up.
You did a very brave, you did a lot of brave things in the book, but when you were going back, as we'll hear in a moment, Ghada went back on a UN consultancy basis to work as a media advisor to the Palestinian Authority, but that gave her an opportunity to make a number of visits to various places, which we'll hear about in a moment. But one of the bravest bits, I thought, and one of the saddest bits, was when you took a trip back to what had been the family house in Jerusalem.
Mm. Yeah, it came about in a very strange way, very unexpectedly. I had been before to the house where we had lived, and it was in West Jerusalem. So if anybody knows the geography of Jerusalem, they'd know that that part is the Israeli part, as you might say, and it became Israeli right from 1948. And that's where our house was. Now, one day I received, while I was working for the Palestinian Authority, I received a strange email from the bureau chief of the New York Times. Now, it's not my custom to receive any communication from the New York Times for obvious reasons. Anyway, this email said to me that this man was the bureau chief in Jerusalem, and he had read my book. Now, that is my first book, In Search of Fatima. I don't know if people are familiar with that book, but it's a memoir about how we left Jerusalem, how we ended up in London, and so on. Now, he had been reading it, and he recognized that the house he was living in seemed to be our old house. So he wrote to say, I have a feeling from the description that this was your house. And I would like to invite you to visit me and to see if indeed it was your house. So, I thought it was astonishing. So I went. And and it was very sad because I went through the neighborhood. Now, I don't remember much about it, but I do remember somehow the feel of it in those days. It was always tranquil, sunny afternoons. We children used to play, the adults were having siestas. It was peaceful, tranquil, and very lovely in my memory.
A bit like the book festival.
But there we are, so I went, and indeed he was there, and it turned out that our house somebody had built an upper story. Now, our house was a villa. It didn't have 2 floors. It was like, and somebody had built an upper story, which the New York Times bought in something like 1983, and became the flat where their bureau chiefs lived. And so this was where this man was living. When I looked at the house, there was no question it was our house. Anyway, he invited me in and so on. It was very, the whole thing was sad, but it was also made me very angry because this man, I said, well, you've read my memoir? And he said, yes, and I liked it very much. I thought it was very informative and so on. So I said, well, you know what happened then, don't you, in 1948? And you know that the house you're living above was our house. And the reason you're here and the Israeli family that's living in it now is because I'm not here. So what do you feel about that? Anyway, he hummed and hawed and was extremely evasive and said, well, something about history and these things happen. But I said, but how can you feel the same about a state that was set up in this way? It was set up because we had been thrown out. That's how Israel came into being. And this is the Israel you, admire? I mean, what is this? And it was no good at all. I would see he regretted the moment he'd ever invited me. Anyway, so he did. He asked the people downstairs, and they were very eager to show me around, and that's what happened. I went around. I had a look, and it was the same house, but of course it wasn't the same house. Our ghosts were there, but that was it. So yes, it was sad.
One of the things about this book, one of the many things about this book that I found admirable, was the fact that you were unflinchingly honest about the Palestinian Authority, about the bizarre ongoings and ministerial rivalries and all of the other bits, which made it sound a bit like, in the thick of it. But with a Gaza twist, with a Ramallah twist. So perhaps you'd like to read for your first reading just a little bit when you arrive and they welcome the doctor from London.
Yes, I'd come as a consultant to the Ministry of Media and Communications to advise them on how we present the Palestinian case to a Western audience. Now, I had worked in the media for some time. I'd been very active in the Palestinian cause, and therefore I had a certain amount of experience, which is why I was invited to do this. However, there was a situation at this ministry which I knew nothing about. Turned out that the ministry was headed by the deputy minister, not the full minister. And he took an instant dislike to me, and I didn't understand. But anyway, I went to say hello, to introduce myself, but to my surprise and dismay, he was not alone, because I thought, well, I'd go and I'd say hello, and this is what I'm doing, and what should I be doing, etc. Not a bit of it. He was there with some men with beards and rolling, beads, prayer beads. And I went in, and he got up with sort of exaggerated eagerness. "Ah, Doctora," said the deputy minister affably as I entered, standing up and coming forward to greet me. He was a dapper, shortish man with a smooth face and thick lensed glasses. "Please sit down. Let me get you some coffee." Another man who had been lolling on a chair behind the door got up and left, presumably to order the coffee. Two other men were sitting in the office. "Let me introduce our brothers, Taysir and the other brother, Abdullah," Dr. Sabah said, pointing to the two men, both bearded and playing with their worry beads. "This is Dr. Ghada, who has come here from England, which we appreciate very much, of course, to advise us on our work." Turning to me, he went on, "The brothers are visitors from Gaza, and I'm sure you won't mind if they listen in on our conversation." "Of course not," I responded, but I had been expecting to be alone with him for a discussion among equals to get a better idea about my work and what was expected of me. I also wanted to discuss Esperance, that was the office manager, and her unhelpful attitude towards me. I certainly had not anticipated this lineup of what were clearly the deputy minister's cronies. There was a knock on the door, and Esperance walked in. "Welcome, Miss Esperance," said Dr. Sabah, and turning to me, "I've invited her to join us. She's an indispensable part of our office. We couldn't do without her." "Well now," he continued, pushing his swivel chair back from the desk and crossing his legs. He too had worry beads, which he now started to roll with his fingers. "Can I ask first of all what you, Dr. Ghada, a doctor of medicine as I understand it, are doing offering advice on a field which is not your own? I mean, you come all the way from London, leaving your great medical practice, I presume, to be here in this place to work on media and communications of all things with us. What has this to do with you? I simply don't understand." He affected a look of genuine puzzlement.
They really know how to make you feel welcome in these places.
Exactly. It was dreadful. And of course, I had no way of knowing that the deputy minister and the minister loathed each other. And therefore, anything to do, and they operated in different buildings. They all issued contradictory orders. They gave out orders to their staff, which were often contradictory, but, and anything to do with the minister, as far as the deputy minister was concerned, was
a bad idea.
Bad and hateful. So, of course, I, having been invited to the ministry by the minister, immediately became an object of hate. It was very unpleasant.
At which point you wondered exactly why you decided to transfer to Ramallah for a period?
I did. I had many moments of doubt. Why had I come? And, and I'd come with some kind of idealistic notion that I was returning in a sort of way, and that I would find something of the essence of Palestine that I had missed throughout my life. And thought I could reconnect with. Well, nothing could have been further from the truth as far as working in these ministries was concerned.
The strange thing about it, well, perhaps not strange given the circumstances, but they constructed a kind of fake state within a state in the authority where everything was going on as if there were genuine ministries with genuine powers, yet all the time there was a very limited number of decisions they could take about the future of the territory.
Yes, that was actually surreal, I have to tell you, because the Palestinian Authority presented itself as a state, really. It had ministries, and it had departments it had a cabinet office, it had a prime minister, a president, ministers, and so on. But president of what? I mean, they had not the slightest sovereignty on any part of the land that they lived on. The meanest Israeli soldier could have stopped the president from crossing a checkpoint. I mean, that was the reality. Yet, people were engaged in these kind of petty office politics. There were rivalries, as if for all the world, this was actually a real state. It was really very uncomfortable, that.
You talk quite a lot about the kind of, not just the prejudices, but the kind of indignities that were visited on people on a daily basis. But perhaps the greatest symbol of these indignities is the separation wall, and you did go and visit that as well. So perhaps you'd like to read a little bit about that visit.
Well, I don't know how many of you have travelled to that part of the world and seen the wall, but it's really quite extraordinary. And so early on, I went with a demonstration actually against the wall, and I joined it, and I had a look at this wall, and I found myself very, very disturbed by it. It was so high and so formidable, really. It was the idea of actually crossing it is absolutely impossible. And so, but it disturbed me an awful lot. I wondered why I felt so disturbed by it. After all, Israel's transgressions against the Palestinians were nothing new to me. I had been campaigning against them since 1971 and was familiar with the long catalogue of its attacks and misdemeanors over the years. Surely the wall was but another addition to a long, unsavory list. But yet, it wasn't. It was in a different league, a symbol of something indefinably cruel, a brutal expression of Israeli entitlement. What else could explain these mighty fortifications, as if wild beasts and ravening wolves roamed the other side and had to be kept out at all costs? Of course, the wall was not everywhere the same high structure, as where I was standing, but it was an electrified fence with deep ditches on either side in some places. But wherever there were Palestinian urban areas, it assumed the shape before me now, and fence or wall, it was impossible to cross. And in a way, when you looked at it, okay, what was it? You could say it was a plain and simple seizure of other people's property. But for me, the wall signified much more. For behind its huge bulk was blotted out, and deliberately so, the physical presence, the very thought even, of another people who walked and breathed there, as if they had no right even to be alive. Its brazen message to the world was that this country was Israel's, and Israel's alone, to settle, loot, divide, carve up, refashion, rename, and do with whatever it pleased.
Which brings us really to very recent events, Ghada, and the firebombing of a home by settlers in the West Bank. I mean, that's perhaps not a novelty anymore, sadly, but it was a particularly grotesque expression of the feeling that these settlers had that this land was very definitely their land and most especially not yours.
Yeah, I mean, people may be aware, having read in the news, this horrific attack by very aggressive Israeli settlers on the West Bank who went to a Palestinian, a farming community, a village, and burnt through fire at one of the houses, which burnt a child, a baby of 18 months, just simply set it alight. And the parents likewise, the baby of course died, the father has since died, and the mother is in a very critical condition. Yes, these attacks are common. They are perpetrated by a brand of highly religious zealot who has a strong belief that this is Israel's. Palestinians shouldn't be there, they're vermin and they have to be exterminated. That is the attitude. But the really striking thing about it, which I find people should really look at, not so much the nature of the brutal nature of the attack, so that's bad enough, but the way they get away with it. The Israeli legal system doesn't hold them to account. They are not punished. They are left to do it again and again. That is extremely shocking. And of course, what is even more shocking is the so-called international community, which is a misnomer if ever I saw one, does absolutely nothing about Israel, about knowing these attacks, knowing these horrific settlements, settlers, these abuses of human rights of an innocent people who have done nothing, the Palestinians. This community does nothing about Israel, so it's allowed to do what it wants.
You noticed at the time of the last Israeli election that there was a kind of change of policy, because there had been some kind of earlier commitment to wind down the building of more settlements, but in order to win the election, that seems to have gone by the board.
Yes, I mean, as I'm sure you know, the most recent Israeli government is composed of the most right-wing, racist ministers you can possibly imagine. And they have an agenda, and the agenda is very clear: to go on settling more and more Palestinian land, to steal Palestinian land and resources, and to do everything possible to torment the population, which with any luck might get up and leave. I mean, that is the agenda.
But you talked about the impotence and perhaps the indifference of the international community, and yet following this latest incident and following some pronouncements by Netanyahu in recent weeks and months, it does seem as if relations between him and President Obama are at a new low. Do you take comfort from that?
Yeah, well, it's very interesting, this relationship between Netanyahu and President Obama, or non-relationship, because this is the latest sort of twist in the story. People may well be aware that Netanyahu has interfered again and again in the US political process. He has, as a foreign state, it's quite extraordinary, he's gone into the very heart of American politics and attempted to divert policy away from the President of the United States and towards an even more pro-Israeli position.
Well, he was invited, of course, by the Republican Party to give an address to Congress.
Indeed, and of course we know why, indeed, because the Republican Party is, I'm afraid, bought hired and bought by the pro-Israel lobby in America. It's the most depressing situation. These congressmen, many senators, they're simply bought by a wealthy pro-Israel lobby, and not least a man called Sheldon Adelson, if anybody's heard of this man, who is a multimillionaire and who funds a lot of the pro-Israel lobbies. So it's obvious, I mean, we know why Congress comes, invites Netanyahu, but the thing about it is that Obama has been humiliated by Netanyahu, has been treated with the greatest of disrespect, and, not surprisingly, Obama doesn't like it. What's he doing about it? What's he doing about it? Well, he's hamstrung because of the pro-Israel lobby. He can't breathe because they're surrounding him, and, you know, they're influential and they're powerful. It's a really depressing sight that. Of course, we live in hope, you know, that one day Americans themselves will think, what the hell are we doing? Why are we allowing a foreign state to dictate our domestic policy?
What do you think the Palestinian diaspora made of the deal just recently struck between America and indeed the other partners with Iran?
Well, it's very interesting, isn't it? That is one of the major foci of Israeli action, of Israeli activism. It's a campaign to make sure that that deal is never signed. Whereas, I mean, and it's very interesting, President Obama knows very, very well, and people who really understand the situation around him, he knows that it has to be done in order to stabilize the region, in order to prevent a dangerous situation from escalating, and of course it has the potential to provoke a huge war. And in that, you see, Israel is very active. Anybody following this story will know that Israel has done everything it can to get the United States to attack Iran. Very dangerous playing about. And so we can only hope that the Congress, which, as you quite rightly asked me about, the Congress, which is enslaved by the pro-Israel lobby, is going to support the rejection of the Iran deal. And that's extremely frightening, you know. So it's a very dangerous situation. And honestly, if anybody puts two and two together and looks at a situation like this, they cannot but come to the conclusion that this is out of hand. Israel is out of hand. It's out of control. You can't allow this small state in the heart of the Arab world to dictate to the major power of the world and to endanger the very region it is actually living in. This is a crazy idea.
I don't want to, end this section in a pessimistic note, but it's difficult to be anything other than pessimistic about the longer-term view, or at least the medium-term view. We've been through the death of the Oslo Peace Accord. We've been through what seems de facto the death of a two-state solution. And also you make the point in your book that the Palestinian diaspora, which at one point coalesced around the fight for the homeland, has now in a sense become embedded in the various parts of the world where they've been scattered. So while they're supportive and financially and politically, they're not actually any more engaged in a real belief that they're going to go home.
Yeah.
So how do you see things panning out in the next few years?
Well, yeah, I'm very. I didn't disguise in this book my own anxiety and depression, disillusionment with what's happened to the Palestinians. Because indeed, as you say, the whole issue of return, which is what I started with, which is a very, very essential and basic idea for Palestinians, remains an aim, but the question is how likely is it to be in fact implemented? How likely is it to happen? And the reality is Israel has existed for long enough to cause a series of changes in the Palestinians. those Palestinian communities that live in the diaspora, like me, although not quite like me because I don't share this apathy, have become more or less embedded in the societies in which they live. That is natural. Their children go to English schools, their children probably will feel differently to their parents about this whole issue. And then you ask yourself, well, who's going to help in returning us to our homeland? Where is this help going to come from? And those are the sort of questions that I raise in the book and that really bother me and make me feel very sad for what's happened to us as a people.
But there's also, Ghada, 2 generations of Palestinians who are there who've known nothing else either. People, not just people in the refugee camps,
Sure.
but the people in Gaza and the West Bank. Anybody under a certain age has never known anything else.
No, but you see, there is something important. There's an important difference. Because they live there, because they are face to face with the Israeli army all the time, and the settlers and all this brutality, they can't afford to have the view that I find in the diaspora. They can't afford to think, well, there we are, what can we do? That's life. They can't. They have to struggle, and they do. Now, the only hope I saw, which I express in the book, is that it is these people under Israel's occupation who live a reality we can't even imagine, who continue to fight, even though they are let down by their leaders again and again. They have remained steadfast. Now, this word in Arabic, sumud, is a really important concept. It's steadfastness. It's that despite all the insults, the abuses, etc., it says, we are not going. We will stay here until this situation is resolved. Now, that steadfastness is the point of encouragement for me. And I came to the conclusion that any hope of our return can only come through them, through their struggle, their daily struggle against Israel, in which there will be a victor. It cannot go on like this, and there will be a victor. And who will be victorious? The people whose roots are in that land, for whom that land is them, interchangeably with them, not the people who have come in from various countries, from Europe, and who have adopted this country. So it's the point of...
You very neatly teed up the last bit, I think we wanted you to read, which is talking about the tensions, if you like, between the stance taken by the current leadership in Palestine and the people who, as you say, are struggling day to day and feel they need to be empowered to take a more belligerent, if you like, but a more proactive stance is probably a better term. Would you like to read that a little bit?
Yes, this is my final extract that I want to share with you. Because, of course, while I was there, among the absurdities that was going on was that the minister organized a big conference, international conference, on how to promote the Palestinian case, media, etc. A waste of money, a waste of time as far as I was concerned. I was very angry about it. Anyway, the conference happened, and at the conference, Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian president, came, and there were a lot of young people who were quite angry because Abbas has officially taken a stance of non-violence, that, we only negotiate, no violence, no violence. So the young people ask him all the time, well, what if it doesn't work? What if non-violence is getting us nowhere? Which, of course, it's not getting them nowhere. He says, he questioned at the conference again and again, what if it doesn't work? What should we do? And his answer is, my position is clear. We go the way of peace. No violence, no force. It's our only course. I am a man of peace and will not discuss anything else. And with that, he raised his hand in farewell and slowly stepped down from the platform, Dr. Farid and his assistants beside him. As he started to walk along the aisle, an earnest-looking young man with 2 or 3 others behind him stepped into his path. Abu Mazen, he said, using the title by which Abbas was familiarly known, after his eldest son Mazen. What should we do if the Israelis don't respond to our being peaceful and go on attacking and killing us just the same? Shouldn't there be a point where we change course? He was clearly desperate for guidance. One of Abbas's guards tried to push him out of the way, but the young man shook him off. I've said all there is to say, Abbas replied. My way is the way of peace. I do not change. And if your way doesn't work, what then? Abbas smiled and said, you heard me. I do not change. This time, his guard succeeded in moving the young man aside. I looked after Abbas as he walked on and wondered if the peaceful strategy he espoused was anything other than an admission of weakness in the face of Israel's might. I remembered the vigorous, creative young revolutionary he had been and could hardly believe that this defeated, submissive creature was the same man.
But let me ask you, Ghada, before we bring in the audience, because there are many people worldwide who support the Palestinian cause who are also opposed to violence because they believe that meeting violence with violence is a zero-sum game.
Yes, and I understand that, and there is a real logic to that, but you see, when you are faced with an enemy like Israel, Israel is armed to the teeth, let's get this straight, and they are not the sort of body, people who, with whom a negotiation would work. I am convinced of that because we have a lot of evidence for that. No negotiation has ever worked. It doesn't work. Why? Because they, Israel, want to keep the land.
But what would be your alternative if you think negotiations don't work?
Well, I tell you, I think that you do not, as a people, an oppressed people who are resisting this kind of oppression, you do not rule out anything. That's
including
my point.
Violence?
Including armed struggle. So you don't have, I never do this, I never do that. You do whatever you can, whatever seems appropriate at the time to try and achieve your aim. That, I believe, is the correct stance, and that is the stance that the Palestinian leadership should take.
But if, forgive me for labouring the point, but if people watch what happened in Gaza with Operation Cast Lead, they watched civilians, children, families being bulldozed to the ground, it can't be the answer surely to do the same in reverse.
Well, unfortunately, we haven't got time because that's a big, big question. Let me try and be brief. Actually, what happened in Gaza was extraordinary in terms of the resistance of Hamas fighters and others. You have to remember, this tiny place is besieged, and yet, they managed to do what they could. They threw rockets, they dug tunnels underneath, you know that, and they had their own fighters coming down through the tunnels and appearing in an Israeli encampment, military encampment, where several soldiers were shot. This is warfare, that's really what it is. And in case anybody asks and says, well, what's the point, what's the use? I'll tell you something very interesting, and this is completely up to date. Israel is negotiating secretly with Hamas for a long-term truce. That Israel wants a truce with Hamas. Hamas has to stop its rockets and has to stop digging tunnels, and in return, the Israelis, will lift the siege of Gaza. Now, when I heard this, I thought it was quite extraordinary. But then, when you think about it, if true, it's an indication of how effective that resistance was as to make Israel ask Hamas to stop these attacks. So that is, I think, the way one should look at it. It's not the orthodox way, it's not the usual way that the media in this country present it, but that actually is the correct way. When you mount a resistance, you are doing it because you have no other option And that is the truth about Gaza and about the Palestinians in general.
I'm only stopping you there because I don't want to disenfranchise the audience completely, and I've gone on far too long.
No.
Could we have the lights up, please?
I really apologise.
There's a hand that went up right away there. If you just wait for the microphone, if you'd be so kind.
The heat in this place, and we're all suffering. It's
You'll be
very
fine.
hot. It's like being in Gaza.
Nobody in Scotland complains about the heat. It's a novelty. Yes, I think the microphone's on its way.
Actually, I've got the microphone at the moment.
Oh, well, in that case, that gentleman's next, if you've stolen it.
Could I ask, there's been a suggestion that if the Palestinian Authority handed their so-called power back to the Israeli government, it would actually cause a crisis within Israel. Could you comment on that scenario?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Thank you for that question. You put your finger on it. There is a weapon in the hands of the Palestinians which they have not used, and which, if they used, it would terrify Israel. And Israeli commentators, I read the Hebrew press, again and again, they're very afraid that the Palestinian Authority would give up and say, right, Israel, you take over. We can't go on like this. The Israelis are terrified of that, you're quite right, because it would mean they have to send their army in to the Palestinian areas, which is a big burden on the Israelis. They'd have to start looking after all the services, the public services that the Palestinian Authority has been taking care of. It would be a disaster for them, and that is a term they use, not me. So that is a very powerful weapon.
Gentleman at the back, I think, has got the mic now.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Ghada, for a very interesting talk and read. You can't see me, can you, really?
No,
I'm
you
out in the
can't.
back here.
If you put a hand up, I'll see you.
There was, I thought there was something missing, though, from our discourse so far, which actually has been dealing with the elites, the political elites, the Americans, the Palestinian Authority, the Israeli government, and so on and so forth. And what's missing, I think, is what we can do as civil society in our country, in Scotland and around the world. People will know about the call for boycott, divestment and sanctions. And that was a very powerful movement in the case of South Africa. And I just wonder what you feel about that initiative, really, on behalf of civil society in Palestine, actually, and whether you think there's, if you like, much future in that kind of approach.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Do you want to take some more?
No, you answered that, but the gentleman there is going to get a very sore arm if he doesn't get the microphone in a minute.
And thank you very much for raising that. Indeed, I did miss that out, and let me just put that right. I have not talked about the tremendous popular support at the popular level for the Palestinians. And that's what I meant by my first remark about you being here because it's Palestine. Indeed, there has been a total sea change in my lifetime from a time when nobody really knew about Palestine and certainly had no sympathy for the Palestinians, to the situation today, and particularly in Scotland. I mean, it's extraordinary. So there's that. But out of that, as you quite rightly point out, the BDS, the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions movement, has come about, and I think is not only powerful, it's spreading everywhere, it's becoming global, it's extremely effective. The Israelis are in a panic, and I believe that to be the real way forward for civil society. It worked in South Africa, it will work in the case of Palestine. I encourage everybody who cares about the Palestinians to join BDS and do what they can to assist this wonderful movement.
Thank you, gentleman in the middle.
Yes, these are very general things and they're not going to happen overnight. But it seems to me in recent years, the prospects of Israel's future have really nosedived, actually. As you say, by defeating the two-state solution, the single-state solution will destroy Israel, I would have thought. The other thing is that by concentrating so much on settlements, settlements is not a popular idea in the world. In fact, I thought the world is pretty hostile to it. And therefore, that's Israel going it alone. And Israel, the idea of going to Washington to argue against the president might have short-term things, but Americans don't like that at all. And I'm told, I don't know if it's true, that young Jewish Americans are very much turning against all this. So it seems to me, although nothing happens overnight, the future of Israel is actually not a good one for the Zionists.
Yes, thank you. Very well informed. Yes, that's right. And I don't think the future of Israel in the long term is good. No. And of course, it's entirely by their own hand, of their own making. But yes, the Americans will realize at some point that this is not acceptable. And secondly, of course, because of the push of popular opinion, because there really is such a constituency now on the side of the Palestinians, it has a momentum. And although, as you say, BDS might be slow, you'd be amazed how rapidly it is expanding. I mean, I'm completely amazed by every day there's a thing about a university here or a company there or a church divesting, taking away their investments, in an Israeli company. And so on. It's really wonderful. So you're right. In the long term, I think, and maybe it won't be as long as we think, the Israelis are exactly on a path to self-destruction.
Isn't it fair to note, too, there's a significant number of Israeli academics who themselves are opposed to the direction that's being taken?
Yes, by the way, I mean, it is not to say, by the way, that Israel is monolithic, it's just one block of hostile people. No, you're right. There are people who are interested, who have a conscience, who are interested in justice, who don't like to see this sort of thing. And indeed, a number of, let's not get carried away, it's not that many, but it's a number of Israeli academics, intellectuals are very much against the policies of their government and very and against the whole idea of Zionism, the Jewish state, etc. So yes, that is an also interesting change.
There's a gentleman there, and then there's a lady on the aisle.
Thank you. You spoke about the importance of the Arabic word sumud, steadfastness, and I wonder, as an aspect of return, how important is the preservation of the Palestinian Arabic language in the Palestinian diaspora, and whether that is being maintained?
Well, very good question, yes. Because language is absolutely vital, isn't it? It's a tool of identity. It's a tool of awareness that you belong to a group which speaks your language. You're absolutely right. Now, it's split. It's very peculiar, the situation we're in. On the one hand, though I gave you perhaps a pessimistic picture of the younger generation of Palestinians who want to make their own lives and who don't know much about it. On the other hand, I can assure you there is a whole lot of second, third generation Palestinians, young people, who are more active than ever I was and who campaign and who are passionate about the cause. And the Arabic language, it should be a crucial part of that. Sadly, all too many, because the whole environment. They go to school, their friends aren't Arabic speakers, so on. That is a real threat. That is a bit of a danger, yes.
Thank you. Up the back there, yes.
I have one comment and one question. The comment is, you talk about Samud, but when you look at what the governments of the Arab world are doing through the Arab League and other entities, the disunity through that is absolutely quite shocking. The question I wanted to ask is about memory and building on the comment the gentleman said about language. I work with a lot of artists in the Middle East, and they obviously often go and explore the concept of memory, if you're Lebanese, if you're Palestinian, if you're Syrian now. I understand that there has been a lot of eradication of Palestinian history over the years, but now there is the Palestinian Museum that is just been announced in the last few days. It will open in 2016. How important will the Palestinian Museum be in retaining Palestinian identity, not only for the nationals that live there, but for the diaspora as well?
Well, you're right. The importance of memory, the way that the Israelis have tried to erase the memory that there was anything Palestinian, erase history, extremely important. And I think a museum or any cultural activity, in fact, which reinforces the unique identity of these people is highly important. You put your finger on a really important issue. And, I can only say that I'm glad that is, in addition to the number of what's called oral history projects, they're all over the place, where belatedly Palestinians have realized that memory will go, the remembrance of what happened will go when the older generation dies. So they are going around recording all these memories of elderly, very elderly people, how they left Palestine, what happened. It's all part of that same campaign.
Do you want to quickly comment on the comment that the lady made about the behaviour of surrounding Arab regimes?
Well, these questions, amazing audience. Each of these questions could be another lecture. I mean, honestly.
We don't have time.
Fortunately, in this issue, I have no reason to defend the Arab states. None. So I'm not in a position where I have to say to you, well, but then you can understand it. Not at all. The Arab states, their record on their more recent record on the Palestinian issue is a disgrace. But there is something I must remind you of. When we were expelled and dispossessed in 1948, the majority of people went to the surrounding Arab countries where they were given refuge and where they were housed, often in people's houses. I mean, there are many, many stories of the generosity of so many ordinary people. That must not be forgotten. And the refugees remain in those countries, but they remain because the countries are hosting them. So we mustn't discount that. Officially, the governments of the Arab world have let the Palestinians down again and again and again. If they were to unite, if they were to understand that Israel is their common enemy, it's not just our enemy, it's a common enemy, then you would see real changes. Until that happens, I'm afraid it's like that.
We've got time for one quick last question.
You mentioned the strong pro-Israeli lobby in America, and always used to assume that was people of Jewish origins, but my understanding is now at least half of those are sort of right-wing Christians. Given that the only Christians in the area are Palestinians, why do you think that is?
Well, that's a very good point. You know that in the United States there are at least 70 million evangelical Christians or Christian Zionists who are not Jewish and who support the state of Israel blindly and who are very difficult people. Yes, and you're quite right. The lobby encourages them. The pro-Israel lobby encourages them because they are allies in this particular thing. And which reminds me, a gentleman made a very good point I didn't respond to about the way that American Jews are turning away from Israel. That is a reality. There is now a real change in American Jewish communities, which always Israel had been able to rely on, and which it now can't. That is a real change, and it's very serious for the Israelis. But back to the point about the Christian Zionists, yes, and the problem is it's nothing to do with Christianity. These people are have a very specific version of Christianity, which is to do with the Messiah coming back to Israel, to Palestine, salvation, the rapture, all this stuff which they believe in, and obviously can make no link between that story and these extraordinary aspirations and the real Christians living in the area who should have been their brothers and sisters but are not. Can I say to you very quickly that that sentiment is shared, I'm sorry to say, by the churches in this country, the Protestant churches in this country. The Protestant church does not seem to understand that there are Arab Christians that it should support and not Israel. And it's very disappointing to me that so many established churches haven't learned this lesson and continue to either be neutral, which is not possible on this issue, or to support Israel.
Ladies and gentlemen, the wonderful thing about this book is that it reads exactly as Ghada speaks. So she's in the room with you when you're reading it, as well as she's in the room with us here. And she's not going to rush away from the book festival. She's going to be in the main bookshop talking to you and signing copies of the book. It's a terrific read, as you might imagine, having listened to her this last hour. Please join me in thanking Ghada Karmi.